Uh-huh.
Well, Jill, welcome to the Light Path podcast. I have been so looking forward to our chat. We've been in communication for a while, and I think this is a topic that doesn't really get talked about. And I've been really keen to talk to someone about the whole process or concept of dying. But I know many people listening to this will be familiar with the concept of a birth doula,
Mm-hmm.
but the death doula role, I think, is such an important one. So I can't wait to dive into that with you and to find out exactly what that is. But first of all, I'd love just to hear your story. Like, how did you come to work in this field and helping people transition?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love talking about all of this. So I really enjoy this conversation, opening people up to the concept of death doulas and really just getting people more comfortable hearing somebody talk about death and dying and grief in a way that's not scary. It's not morbid. It's not overwhelming. So I'm excited. And I started this work, I would say professionally 4 years ago.
Mhm.
But it goes back, I think, even to childhood. You know, when like people talk about the thing that they were like born to do, I think this is what I was born to do. I just didn't know about it until about, I don't know, 2010 is when I really got the first idea of, oh, I think maybe I want to work with people who are dying. But even when I was a child, I used to volunteer with my grandmother. We would go to local like nursing homes, assisted livings, and she said even when I was really little, I would go up to the people that everybody else was kind of like shying away from because they were really getting closer to death. And I would go up to them and I would talk to them, and it never scared me. I helped even when my grandfather was dying. I was 4 when he died. My mom and grandmom talk about how I would push him around in the wheelchair and I would talk to him and he would want things. And I was the only person that could understand what he was asking for. And so I think it was just something that I was naturally kind of like drawn to, but you know how life works. And so I went to college to be a pastry chef. That's what I have done for close to 30 years now. I've been working in food service. But when I was living in California, got married. And then my grandmother was turning 90. So she said, well, my husband and I, we were like, we want to open a bakery. And she said, well, why don't you move home with me? It'll keep me in my house, right? She'd lived in this house since she was 20. So she'd been there for like 70 years. And she said, it'll keep me in my house. And then you don't have to pay rent and you can open your bakery and, it'll work out well for everybody. And we had been home, I think maybe a week. And she said, I found this weird lump in my chest. And we went to the doctor and they said, oh, it's probably not cancer because it wasn't the breast. It was like in the chest muscle. And then they, went in, they did the surgery, and the doctor came out and he said, actually, I was wrong. It is cancer. And so we went through 4 years of her being 90 to 94 of radiation and surgeries and just like the whole process. That when we got to the active dying phase, like the last couple of weeks of her life, and at that point, I had a bakery, I had a 6-month-old baby, and we were living with grandma. So when the doctor said, we're going to send grandma home on hospice, who's going to take care of her? I said, oh, I will. Because I mean, I'm already doing it anyway, right? I'd already been doing her wash and helping with all those things. And I thought, okay, grandma's maybe going to sleep a lot and then just like peacefully die like you see in movies.
Mm.
And that's not the reality. The first night I was home with her, she didn't know who I was. She said to me, oh, my granddaughter has a baby the same age as yours. Because I'm like nursing the baby. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, but I am your granddaughter. And she said, no, you're not. You're the nurse. And right then I was like, oh, I don't know what's going on. And this is not the reality that I was expecting. And thankfully, hospice, when the nurse came in, I asked so many questions. And I was like, she's talking to people that aren't there. She doesn't know who I am sometimes, like just all these things. And she said to me, honestly, this is all normal. This is all natural. As people near the end of life, these are things that happen. And so then once I understood that it was normal and natural for her to be talking to people in the middle of the night that weren't there, then I started to get curious. So when I was sitting with her and she said, you don't hear those women that are singing? They're standing right behind you. Rather than being like upset or afraid, I was like, no, I don't hear them. Like, what do they look like? What are they singing? What does it sound like? I just started asking questions and just really showing up in a way that allowed me to have a really beautiful experience with somebody that I loved so much because she basically raised me. I had a single mom. So, like, grandma was the person that raised me. And so it was such a gift that I was able to give her. And after she died, actually, even before that, I was talking to the hospice nurses and I was like, I think I want to do what you do. And the one, she was like, oh, you could do this. You would be great at it. And I was like, but I don't know if I could do like what you're doing. Like I was watching them do the nursing stuff and I was like, I'm not sure about that.
Mm.
But, she died. And I said to my husband, I might want to go back to school to be a hospice nurse. And he was like, whatever you want to do. But again, I had a bakery, I had a baby. So it just kind of like stayed in the back of my mind. And that was in 2010. We ended up closing the bakery. We had a second child. We moved, right? Life just kept going. And I had started thinking as I was like 39, getting ready to turn 40, I was like, I don't want to be in a kitchen until I'm 65.
Mm.
Like it's hard work to work in a kitchen. And I couldn't imagine doing it like 25 more years. And so I started thinking again about like, well, what do I really want to do? Like I kind of already have a few different skills under my belt. I was already doing Reiki. I taught yoga for a while. Like there was other things that I had already been doing. And then I heard somebody talk about being a death doula on a podcast. And like as soon as I heard it, I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. Like that's it. But I was afraid. I was getting ready to turn 40, thinking I have no real college degree. I mean, a culinary school degree doesn't count. So if I was going to go back to school to be like a nurse or something, I would have had to have started from the beginning. So I started looking into death doula trainings and was really just kind of afraid. It was a big change. I had a lot of imposter syndrome of like, I'm going from food service to the end of life. Like that's a whole different thing. And I started my training in January of 2020. At that point, I had two kids, I had two jobs. I was thinking it was going to take me a really long time. And then it didn't, because by March of 2020, I had a lot of free time.
Mm.
And so it just kind of progressed a lot faster than I thought. But yeah, so now I've had my business End of Life Clarity now for 4 years. It has definitely not been an easy journey because a lot of people, they've heard of birth doulas, but I still, a lot of times when I say to somebody, I'm a death doula, they say, wait, you're a what? What do you do? And so I'm trying to like explain it to people because it is needed. It's a service that I think more and more people are going to need. It is very helpful, but at this point, it's still not widely known. So the business part's a little bit of a struggle, but that's why I actually started designing t-shirts. I have death positive t-shirts now that I'm designing because that's one of the things. Again, I want people to talk about death and dying more. And there's nothing better than wearing a shirt that has like some quote on it that somebody is like, what does that mean? What does that say? And then they start talking to me about death, and I love it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Like, as a society or culture, death is just not talked about, and it's almost a administrative function when it happens, as opposed to an experience that we are all going to go through.
Mhm.
So and we're going to go through it consciously. We weren't consciously born, none of us really remember that. So talk to me about, well, educate us. What is a death doula? And even what that word doula means, because we apply it obviously to birth as well. So what is a death doula?
So doula themselves, I don't remember the exact definition, but it basically means somebody that assists people in transitions in life.
Yeah.
And so birth doulas help people that are birthing. They help bring the baby into the world, but then also will usually assist the mothers and the fathers with the beginning stages, because anybody that's ever had a baby, all of a sudden they like hand it to you and they're like, here you go, have fun, figure it out as you go. And so with death doulas, we kind of do the same thing, but on the opposite end of the lifespan. So we'll help people and their families with the transition at end of life. Now, it's completely non-medical care. So again, we're not nurses, we're not doctors. even though some people that are nurses or doctors or social workers become death doulas as well, when you're filling the role as a death doula, it's more to support people through the emotional, even the spiritual, even though most of us don't necessarily say like, well, I'm, Catholic or Christian or whatever it is, right? We're there to just support people in their process, whatever it is they're going through. And so it's one of those things where sometimes it almost makes more sense to people if I say I'm almost like a life coach, but I'm coaching you through a very specific time in life, which is the end of life. And that's why I actually like to work with people that aren't even necessarily dying, because all of us are dying, right? If you really think about it, if
Yeah.
you are alive,
Yeah.
we're all dying, right? We're
Yeah.
all getting one step closer, whether it's tomorrow or 20 or 40 years, we don't know. But I like to work with people, having them think about their fears, think about their anxieties, really kind of start planning for what's important to them. Because what's important to me now at 45 is going to be different than what's important to me at 85. But if I don't start thinking about it now, if I don't start planning for it now, I'm not going to, first off, have the experience that I potentially want. I mean, again, this is assuming I don't have a car accident and like die suddenly. But if I were to get a terminal diagnosis or something were to happen where I end up in a hospital, I'm going to, potentially go through things that I would not want if I was given the opportunity to voice what I want. Well, I have the opportunity now to voice what I want. So I need to have this conversation with my husband and get things down in writing so that he's not trying to answer questions that he's emotionally overwhelmed for. And, especially if I were to say have an accident and end up in a hospital and they're saying to him, well, would she want to be intubated, which is, when they put that tube down your throat, would she want these different treatments? I mean, he's really got to deal with his own thing. He needs to deal with his emotions. He needs to deal with our children. He needs to deal with those things, not answering questions that we'd never talked about, because he's going to have to make the decision if I can't talk.
Yeah.
And so it really is something where I want to work with more people that are at all stages of life, just getting clear on what's important. And the more that we think about our death, right? Because again, it's going to happen to all of us. The more that we can prepare ourselves for it, the less anxiety we're going to have. And really, I found the more that I actually fully live my life, the more that I got okay with the fact that it's going to end one day, the more that I am fully present in the moment now, because I appreciate every moment in a way that I didn't before. And so it changed the way that I lived. And that's, I think, the best benefit of all of this is that you fully live your life when you actually get okay with the fact that it's going to end one day. But
Yeah.
that's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about.
We don't even want to think about it. And I want to come back to like the practicalities of death doulaing when you're helping someone transition, but I'd never thought of a death doula as being someone who could maybe work with us in terms of opening up these conversations or essentially planning for the inevitable or even the fear that we might hold of the death, or of our inevitable death. So when you're working with people in that sense, what do you find that people are most afraid of?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I've found really interesting is I'll ask people, what is it you're most afraid of? The process leading up to death, the moment of death, or what comes after death?
Mm.
And usually people will have a very clear answer. Well, I'm afraid of suffering. I've seen my mom or my loved one go through this really terrible process. Or I'm afraid that the moment of death might actually hurt. Like, I don't know. I don't know what happens when people die. I've never seen it in real life. I've never experienced it, with a loved one. So I'm afraid of what actually happens. Or people say to me, I don't know what's going to happen after I die. I don't believe in heaven. I don't believe in the things that tend to give people some comfort. And so I'm really afraid of what's going to happen to me after I die. And if I can help them get clear on what they're most afraid of, then I can help them understand that if it's the process of leading up to death, other than, again, maybe a car accident, like a tragedy, there's not much we could really do about that other than wear our seatbelts, don't speed, like don't potentially do things that put you in a space. Like I used to do some crazy things when I was younger. Now I'm much more aware
Mm.
of putting myself at risk of where I might die because I don't want to die yet. I want to live as long as I can to be around for my children, right? And so I take the proper precautions to prevent that as much as I can. And then when it comes to, potentially having an illness or a disease that will lead to suffering, the best way to prevent that long-term suffering is to get really clear on what's important to you. Because sometimes people, like my grandmother is a great example. If I would have known then what I know now, at 90 years old, I would have said to the doctor, what'll happen if we don't give her radiation?
Yeah.
Because really, that's what ended up killing her. The
Yeah.
radiation just eroded so much, and then she got an infection, and then the infection is what ended up killing her. What if we just give her the surgery? What if we just take out as much as you can and then send her home and let her be? She's
Mhm.
90. But instead, we kept putting her through these treatments because the doctors were like, well, she needs the radiation. But does she really? And now that I know better, I would have really actually said, probably let's not do it. But I didn't know better at that time. And so we put her through a lot of pain and suffering when really she didn't have to suffer that way.
Mhm.
And so there are things that we can do to prevent some of that suffering, right? There's sometimes people, they go through treatment for a certain amount of time and then it's like it's really not doing what we hoped. Well, okay, let's switch to what they would call comfort care. Let's just keep people comfortable. Stop all the treatment, stop all these things that are potentially extending their life, but reducing the quality. Let's keep them comfortable so they can enjoy whatever life they have left. But if we don't know to ask those questions, if we haven't thought about what's important to us, we're not necessarily going to get what we want. So there might be more pain and suffering than we need. As far as the moment of death, honestly, it seems really peaceful. I mean,
Mm.
people tend to, they again, leading up to it, there might be some like breathing that sounds a little weird. There might be some things that seem unpleasant, but the moment of actual death seems so peaceful. It seems like in some ways a really beautiful thing where their whole body just like lets go. Everything that they've just been holding is now like released and they let go and it's peaceful. It doesn't seem like there's anything to be afraid of. There has been no evidence that I've seen, anything that I've read or learned that makes us think that the moment of death would be scary or painful physically to the body. And then as far as the afterlife, honestly, none of us really know for sure, right? There's nobody, I don't care who you are. You can argue all you want to with me about people's religious beliefs. I believe this, I believe that. Okay, fine. But there's no proof of any of it. But what I have heard is people that have had near-death experiences, people that have again been kind of around somebody that's been dying. They sometimes have what's called a shared death experience. So not a near death experience, but a shared death experience where even doctors have reported this, where they go through the process of like, they almost feel like their body or their soul's leaving their body along with the person that's dying. It seems like whatever it is that comes after this is actually probably better than reality that we live in now. I've talked to people that have had near-death experiences that have said, I don't want to die now, but honestly, there's part of me that can't wait to go back to wherever we went to when we
Mm.
had that near-death experience because it was better than reality is here. So whatever it is, it seems like it's probably going to be fine at the worst and really nice at the best, right? And so I don't really worry about it, even though I have no idea where I'm going to go. I mean, I really genuinely don't know. I love to think about it. I love to talk about it, but I don't know. And so if we could really figure out what people are afraid of when it comes to death, then there's things we can
Mm.
do to
Yeah.
make those fears lessen. And sometimes just talking about it makes people feel better. Most people, again, have never thought about it. They've never talked to anybody about it. Or when they do try to talk to people, especially I'll find, people that are maybe a little bit older or somebody that maybe does have an illness and they'll want to talk to their family members about it. And they get that response of like, oh, we don't need to talk about that now. You're not dying now. We don't need to talk about it. So people shut that conversation down. Where if we can open up to the conversation, understand that having the conversation isn't going to make it happen, right? It's not like talking
Mm.
about our death means it's going to happen anytime soon. It doesn't even mean sometimes, I've had the conversation where I'll say to people, my husband and I talk about him dying. And they'll say, oh, so you'd be fine if he died? Well, no, I would not be fine if he died. But I will be more prepared if he died than most people, because I also know that, like, right now, I just saw like the little text box pop up. He's in Chicago. He's waiting for a flight. The flight's delayed, the whole thing, right? Every time he goes away, there's always part of me that's like, he might not come home.
Mm.
Somebody's husband's not coming home tonight, right? Like, that is the reality. But when he leaves, I make the effort to really, I love you, goodbye, I'll see you soon. I connect with him so much more than I think, honestly, I ever used to. And most people do, because we're so caught up in the day to day. Or, I mean, he's my husband. He annoys me sometimes.
Yeah.
We get annoyed with people. So we just kind of are like, oh, I just can't deal with them right now. You know what? When he leaves that house, I don't care how annoyed I am. Because if he were to die, I know that the last thing that I said to him, I know that the last moment wasn't me being frustrated or annoyed. It was me saying, I love you so much and I appreciate you, right?
Yeah.
Because that is the truth under all the other human stuff. And so, again, I wouldn't be fine if he died, but I wouldn't have the same regrets. I wouldn't have that same feeling of like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad. And I'll never forgive myself because when he left, I was mad at him and I didn't even say goodbye. And so again, it changed the way that I live my life.
Oh, so much I want to pick up on there. Um, so obviously, I work in spirituality. So there's this idea or this concept of us being able to channel and tap into the spirit world. And so that my work has completely alleviated any type of fear I have of dying, because I believe I see it from that perspective. I know other people don't believe that, but that's totally fine. But if you don't believe that, you're probably not on this podcast anyway, listening to it. So,
Probably.
but I will pop it in the show notes. But Anita, and I can't remember her last name, Manjoli or someone like that, but she actually wrote a book about herself when she died, and then she was
Mhm.
dead for like a significant period of time, and she came back and they brought her back and she wrote a book about her experience. So if that's something you're interested in, you can read her experience, whether or not that's an experience that you think is accurate or whatever. But just if that's something that does concern you, there are, you know, experiences out there, like you say, that people that have had these near-death experiences. But I agree with you. I've never heard of it not being anything other than a release or peace, and that bliss kind of feeling, because once we take away all those human layers, I mean, that is all that there is. But my brother-in-law always picks on our family, because he always talks about how he's never come across a family that talks about death more than us. And we actually don't talk about death. We always joke about inheritances and trust funds and stuff like that. So our way of talking about death is like, where's the money going to go? And we joke about it. But I think that's our way of looking after each other in terms of the administrative side of things.
Mhm.
What we don't ever talk about is the grief side of things. And I wonder if that's why, just listening to you speak, it made me think, is it because we, as a society or a culture, we don't really understand or prepare for grief, and we don't teach grief? Like, and everyone who listens to this podcast will know I used to be a kindergarten teacher, and we teach all the emotions and we try to help them emotionally regulate and develop. But I've never, ever talked about grief with my little ones. And in a 20-year teaching history, one of my students did pass. And that is the
Oh
only time
no.
she was very unwell. And it was actually really beautiful. But I sat them down in a circle and to speak to 5-year-olds about their friend, that had just passed, and to help them understand that, I felt so out of my depth. Because I don't know about grief. I've experienced it. I experience it every day because I miss the people that I love that have passed. But I, though, who tap into spirit, I don't really have a good relationship with grief. So do you think that's why maybe people don't talk about death, because we don't really understand grief?
That's for sure, I think, a piece of why we don't talk about death. And for me, I know when I started to become a death doula, I wasn't afraid of death. If anything, I'd always been fascinated with it and curious about it. But the more that I started to learn about grief, I realized that when I was 4, when my grandfather died, I really wasn't even told that he died. They didn't have me go to the funeral. It was kind of like grandpa was here and then he was gone. And I'm sure at some point somebody was like, oh, grandpa died. But again, they probably didn't even say that. They probably, oh, he passed away. He went to a better place. Like all these things that people say to children, that children are like, well, what does that even mean? And so when I started working with grief and I started really learning about how many of us hold on to unprocessed grief, I like to do rituals. I'm a big person that I like to create a ritual around things that I want to work with. And so I created like a whole ritual where I was like, all right, I'm going to find that grief. We're going to work with it. We're going to tap into it. And I had so much stored grief for my grandfather that I was never able to say goodbye to, that I was never able to have closure on. I had grief around the fact that like my father was never around. And there was grief and there was anger actually at both of them, because I had thought to myself how much quote unquote trouble I got into because my grandfather and my father weren't around. So I didn't have a man in my life. Or like if my grandfather would have lived longer, he had lung cancer that spread to his brain. So again, he died when I was 4. My grandmother died when I was 32. So she lived a long time without him. He could have potentially been around that long. My life would have been completely different. I understand now that doesn't mean it would have been better or worse, but I still was feeling anger towards him for leaving me. And I would have never admitted that if somebody would have said, are you angry at your grandpa for dying? I would have been like, no, of course not. But when I got really quiet and when I sat with myself and I meditated and I prayed and I asked for answers and I asked for guidance and I asked for my grandfather to come talk to me and to be with me, I realized that I was actually really angry. And it makes me want to cry thinking about it because I was holding all of that, all of these years, and I had no idea. So how many places in my life was I meeting a situation and meeting it with grief and not realizing that that's what I was meeting it with? And so I have found that that's part of why it's so hard for people now when somebody that they love especially dies, or even when a relationship ends or when a job ends, because all of a sudden we feel grief and then it like brings up a lot of the other grief that we have never acknowledged, that we've never processed. And I mean, you probably will totally understand this, that if we don't process it, our body holds it. Just traditional Chinese medicine talks about that. You know, shamanism, they all talk about how we store these things in our body. They don't just go away. And so when we do get to that point where we're very raw, we're very vulnerable because we're at a like really highly charged situation that makes us feel grief, it's bringing up all the other grief we tried to ignore and push down and pretend wasn't there. And so if we could all just get better with working with grief around everything and even admitting that it's grief, right? Like sometimes there's so much shame around feeling grief around things, where I have a Facebook group where I talk about death and dying and grief, right? And I just basically post a question almost every day. And I've had people say like, I don't know if this counts, but I have a lot of grief about my pet dying. I'm like, of course it counts. Of course it counts. Like it's still grief, but people feel ashamed. Or they'll say, I actually have a lot of grief about like my best friend that kind of like broke up with me. Like I really miss them and I'm feeling a lot of loss. Yes, totally. It's all grief. And if we could feel it, if we could honor it, and like you said about all the emotions, right? I think a lot of times too, people think, well, when somebody dies, I'm going to feel really sad because that's what grief is. I mean, yes, there might be sadness, there might be anger, there might be relief, there might be all these feelings that we're not expecting that are all tied up with this situation, with this feeling of grief. But again, if we don't know that, then we're feeling confused, we're feeling shame. I mean, I've talked to people that their abuser died. And there's so much relief around the situation of like, they're gone now. Like, they can't hurt me anymore. I don't have to face them anymore. And I'm like, yes, that is a valid part of grief. You can feel relief over the fact that somebody is not here anymore. And that could still be grief because if nothing else, I realized that I had done this wheel diagram once. It's like a healing exercise where it was like, you draw in the wheel different points of your life and then you color it in as like what it felt like, what the emotions that you felt. So I drew my little wheel and I colored it in, and there was like a really obvious point where like everything was like green and happy and like lovely. And then I hit this moment and then it was dark for like a huge portion of my life. All I felt was like pain and darkness. And I know that that event that happened, I was never the same after that.
Mm.
Well, I need to grieve the fact that like I lost my innocence. I lost all of these parts of myself. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel happiness. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel all of these things that I should have felt if it wasn't for this one person that took that away from me. And yet I never allowed myself to actually grieve. I felt the anger, right? I felt the shame. I felt the embarrassment. I tried to push all of it down. But when I finally said to myself, I can grieve the fact that like I was not able to trust people after that. I can grieve the fact that like that little person was no longer able to feel joy and happiness. Like those are all valid things for us to grieve. But until we get really clear and really honest with ourselves about the fact that grief is a part of life and it's a healthy part of life and it's a natural part of life, that if we don't get clear on that, we're just going to continue to push it down and act like everything's fine to keep putting those band-aids on. And then when somebody that we really love dies, it is going to feel like a tidal wave of grief because it's all the old grief too that's coming up with it. And so when I do work with people, if they're willing to go there, I will help them go through rituals and all, on their own. Like, let's create a ritual that you can do on your own to just feel some of the grief because we need to feel it. What
Yeah.
is the saying? We need to feel it to heal it, right? I mean, but
Yeah.
it really is true. We
So
do
true.
need to feel it to heal it.
Yeah, grief is like you say, like, you're talking about actual passings, but like grieving your kids moving out, grieving your body isn't the same that it used to be,
Hmm.
grieving, losing your cycles as a woman. Like there's just so many moments to grieve at falling out of love with what you used to love.
Hmm.
Not just people. Grief is such a big topic. We could talk about that all day. But
Oh,
I
for
would
sure. I mean, it's definitely a huge topic.
Yeah. I would love to know though, you work with people. So as a death doula, when you step in, it will be different obviously for every client, but when you step in, are you, helping with the practicalities? Are you helping, with the emotional stuff, all of it? Like, what's the process of hiring a death doula?
And again, it can start at any stage of your life because sometimes people will say like, oh, well, should I call you like right at the end? I'm like,
Yeah.
well,
Like, when do I
yeah,
call
you
you?
could, but really the best time to call me would actually be a little bit earlier on. Even if it is somebody, say you get diagnosed with a terminal illness, right?
Mhm.
Even if you're not going to die, even if you're not, or not, again, even if you're not going to die right now,
Yeah.
even if you're going to do the treatments, even if you're going to try all the things, again, let's sit down, let's talk. What's important to you? What are the longer term goals? Like, do you have a date that you really want to stick around for? Your kid's getting married. You really want to be around for that. Or maybe it's just like, I don't know, I want to live as comfortable as possible for as long as possible. But once it starts to hurt really bad, I don't want to do this anymore.
Mm.
Let's get clear on what's important to you. And so I do have a document that I do. it takes about 3 hours, right? And I try to like break it up either into different sessions, or we could do all 3 hours. But part of why it takes so long is because I know this is a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk to people about what's important to them, whether it's, again, medical treatments. Would you want chest compressions if your heart stopped? Would you want to be intubated? Would you, want to be at home, or do you want to be in a hospital when you're actively dying? Like, what's important to you? All the way up to, okay, so, do you want flowers in your room? Do you want music? Do you want aromatherapy? Like, what's important to you when it gets to be closer to your time of death? And so we sit down and we talk about it, and I write it all out on paper. Of course, now I handwrite it, but then I type it up for people. But that's a practical thing, right? That we can do. And it's best to do that when you're clear-minded, when you're not actually close to death. I mean, again, I could still work with people that are closer to death, but then I don't really know as much about them. And that's where I volunteer actually at 2 different hospitals in New Jersey. And so when I go to the hospital, I might be sitting with somebody that's actively dying, or even if they're not actively dying, I sat with, and it is hard for me when it's children,
Right.
teenagers, even young children, right? That's a hard one for me. But I was sitting with a young man that he was completely nonverbal, but he was awake and he was alert. He just couldn't communicate with me. And so I am trying to I'm gonna put some music on. Like, let's try to try a couple different kinds. I didn't want to assume, right? It was like a young Black man. I didn't want to assume he liked this style of music just based off of what he looked like. So I just kept hitting buttons. I was like, how about this one? And then he'd blink, all excited. I'm like, okay, this is as close as we're gonna get. Where if I would have known him before he got to that point, I would have known what kind of music he liked. I would have known more about him. Because that's the thing too. I will pray with people. Again, I grew up Catholic. I'm not Catholic anymore. Actually, now I'm Buddhist. I took my vows to be Buddhist, but really in the long run, I would just say I'm more spiritual, right? I'm open to kind of all of it. I'm on that witchy kind of woo side. But if somebody wants me to do some Catholic prayers, I actually had to look it up on my phone one day. She wanted me to say the Hail Marys with her, and I was like, I don't remember them. So I'm going to look it up
You
on my
should, come on,
phone
you should
just to
remember that.
refresh the memory.
Any good Catholic has that under their belt. Come on.
You know what? Once I saw it, it came back to
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
I was just, as I was trying to do it in my head, I was like, oh
Wait, how
man. I
does
was
it
like,
go?
I don't know exactly how does this go? But I sat and I prayed with her.
Yeah, nice.
But I'm not going to assume that
Yeah,
somebody wants this. And I talked to a woman, she was a hospice nurse in Texas. And she said she got really frustrated once with a chaplain that came in and assumed they were in Texas, assumed that
yeah,
somebody wanted folky, religious Christian music. And she was like, but no, they don't want that. And she kept coming into the room and they kept playing it. And she was like, but they don't, I know they don't want that. They're not Christian. You can't
yeah,
assume based off of where it, I think my husband, I guess probably at this point he's agnostic, but I mean, he was raised atheist. He was raised no religion. If somebody was playing Christian
yeah,
music at his moment of death, he'd come back and haunt me. He would be really mad about that. That is not how he wants to spend his last moments. And so we can't assume what people want. The best way to know is to start this process early,
yeah,
start talking to them, and then planning out the practical stuff. And then as things progress, I will sit and again, I'll talk with people and I let them talk to me about their fears, about their anxieties. Just, a lot of times they're talking about their life, their past experiences, and then they'll kind of swing back around to but I don't know, I have this regret over all these different things. I regret that I didn't spend as much time with my family. I regret that I did a career that my parents wanted me to do and I hated it. I made a ton of money, but I hated it. And I wish I didn't do that because now I'm dying and I think about all these experiences
that you didn't
that
have.
that I didn't have because I was too busy working all the time. And so it's pretty fascinating to go through that process with people, just
Yeah,
allowing them to get closure. And I actually talked to a guy the other day, actually, that this one I thought was really interesting. he said he's nearing death. He's not actively dying, but he is nearing death.
Mm.
And he said he was like listening to a song, and it flashed to him a good friend of his that died in like 1975, so many years ago. And he said it's not like he heard her or saw her, but he felt her presence so strongly that he said he cried for like an hour afterwards. And so
Mm.
then the more we talked, he said, yeah, well, she died, and then my best friend died, and I was only 25 at the time, and my best friend was only 25, and then I was moving, and all these things were happening. So I actually really didn't process much. And I said, maybe that was your body's way of processing some of
Mm.
this grief, allowing yourself to release some of it so that you can get to the point where when it's time for you to die, you're ready. Your body's able to release and let go. And he was like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And I was like, well, that's
Yeah.
why you have me, right? That's
Yeah.
that's why I'm there, is to kind of just help people think about experiences differently, process, let go of regrets and shame, because you're not going to be able to die well if you have a lot of regrets and shame. And so let's talk about it. Let's process it. Now, I've had people tell me all kinds of stuff. They're like, I've literally never told anybody this in my entire life. And I'm like,
Yeah, I
okay,
bet. I bet.
right? Like, and
Yeah.
it's okay, like I try as hard as I can. There's probably only two things. If somebody ever told me they like sexually assaulted a child, I'd have a real hard time with that. Other
Mm.
than that, I don't get, I've had people tell me like I've murdered people. I'm
Oh my
like,
God.
right? I mean, again, because I show up, especially at the hospital, where I'm just so like open to people and their experiences. Where I had one guy, I mean, he told me some crazy stories, and I was like, all right, like, and
Mm.
like this is his process that he needs to go through. I'm not there to judge him. It's
Yeah,
not
I
my,
always see that doula role as that person that is the advocate for the experience. And so by holding them in that, you're just showing up to advocate for them in that experience, whether it's what they want and whether it's, like you say, like holding space for them by just being that ear as they need to say what they need to say. Before I let you go,
Mhm.
I do want to hear your top um, regrets that you hear people have. You just touched on it then, but one of my favorite books is Tuesdays with Maury. And if you've never read it,
Uh-huh.
I'm sure you've read it. Um,
Yeah.
if you've never read it, I really highly suggest Mitch Albloom's Tuesdays with Maury. What is what have you heard? What are the top like 3 or 4 regrets of the dying?
Yeah, I would really say the biggest regret is people regret not getting closure with somebody that they
Mm.
had an argument with, and they had time to apologize or to ask forgiveness, and they didn't do it because our ego gets in the way, we're ashamed, whatever else it is, right? There's all these reasons why. And so as they're nearing death, they're like, I just wish I could say I'm sorry. I wish I could ask for that forgiveness.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is also that regret of putting things in your life in front of things that actually mean the most to you, right? If you asked most people, what means the most to you? My family, right? My children, my spouse, my siblings, right? Whatever it is. But yeah, we almost all of us, and again, I'm guilty of this as well.
Mm.
We put money, working to receive the money, working to feel, I used to do this one, working to feel like I was worth something. The
Yeah.
harder I worked, the more I felt that I was worth taking up space, really,
Yeah.
right? We worked to put our diplomas on the wall, to put our little
Mm.
accolades out. Think even now with social media, how hard we all work to get all the likes, to get all the shares, to get all the stuff. Really, when you're dying, you're not going to care about any of that. What you're going to care about is the time that you spent with your family. And again, the more that I understood that, I actually did a TikTok a couple months ago where I was at my daughter's softball game. And I'm the type of person that I've never really liked being around a lot of people. It's always made me a little anxious. I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable because I've always honestly been a little weird, and I've kind of stuck out of the crowd a little bit. And so I had done this video because I was like, this is honestly something that I feel like is such a gift, that I'm at the softball game and I'm watching her and I'm seeing the sunlight coming down and I'm listening to the people cheering. And I'm fully present in the moment and I'm enjoying it because I know that these are the things I'm going to think about when I'm dying. I'm going to think about those softball games. I'm going to think about those moments when I was with the people that I loved.
Yeah.
And yes, I could have been home on a meeting. I could have been home writing emails. I could have been home making my videos, even though, again, I did make a video, but like I
Mm.
could have been home, quote unquote, working on things. But instead, I was there and I was present, not stressing about all these things. And so those are really the things that people regret the most, is just like not being fully there for the things that actually mean the most to them. Because again, we've all been taught these stories that careers and money and houses and cars and vacations and all these other things are so important, when really our kids don't care about the vacations. Like I
Mm.
would love to take my kids to Paris. I can't do that right now. I can't afford it. But you know what? In the long run, I took them to the mall today. We walked around, we got some pretzels. Like that's what really means the most to them, that I was there with them, I was present with them, I was listening to what they said, I was showing up. And that's what's going to mean something to them. And that's what's going to mean the most to me when I die, is that I was there for those things that really mattered. And you know what? The rest of it, the money, whatever, it'll be fine. I'm not worried about it anymore. I used to worry about it, but honestly, now I really don't worry about it as much anymore.
Yes, I mean, there's so much clarity in the inevitability of death. And I think a lot of us don't want that clarity because it doesn't make the way we're living wrong necessarily, but it will force us to be more authenticity about the way we're living. And as we know, people hate change. But this is why I'm so like proud of people like you that step into the work that is purposeful, that is helpful, because that is, as a society, definitely where we're going. And I'm not sure too many people around the world right now aren't questioning a lot in their lives, as time goes on. It just sounds like such fascinating work. I'll put all your links in the show notes so people can connect with you. And I love the idea of a Facebook group where it's openly talked about and that people are sharing their experiences. So we're not feeling as alone. So we'll definitely tag that in the show notes. But what is one last thing you would like us to know about death itself? Big question that I
I
just
know
threw at
I
you
know. I'm
there.
like, one last thing. Honestly, really, just start talking about it with
Yeah.
your loved ones, right? Like, and that's really the biggest thing with my Facebook group, is I've had people say to me, I never comment in your group, but I will talk to my family about the question that you asked in the group. And then we have these really wonderful conversations, right? It's not as scary. It's like anything, when you're thinking about starting it, when you're thinking about doing it, you have more anxiety, and then you start it and you're like, that wasn't so bad. That's the same thing with a conversation about death, right? That like the thought of starting it sometimes seems scary and overwhelming, but really when you start to have the conversation, it's not as difficult as you think it's going to be. And if anything, it'll probably lead to some of the best conversations you've ever had with the people that you love. So just start it, just talk about it. It will change your life. It'll change the way that you live.
Well, I'm really grateful that you were willing to offer us your time and to begin the conversation with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.